is a reason you were guided to this message today. Archangel Michael is revealing something that many chosen ones are completely unaware of. Your twin flame timeline has already begun to open, but not everyone wants you to reach it. In the spiritual realm, the closer you move toward divine reunion, the louder the distractions become. Have you noticed strange exhaustion that sleep cannot fix? Sudden arguments with people you normally love? Old relationships trying to return out of nowhere? Random fear? Confusion? Doubt that doesn't even feel like your own? These are not random coincidences. Michael says they are often the final waves of resistance before heaven unlocks what has been preparing for years. Because the enemy knows something you may not yet realize. Once your divine timeline fully activates, the version of your life built on delay, manipulation, and spiritual interference can no longer survive. That is why protecting your energy right now is not self-care. It is spiritual warfare. Stay until the end, because Michael reveals the 7 signs that your twin flame timeline is opening, the hidden attacks that many chosen ones mistake for ordinary life, and the one spiritual decision you must make today to avoid delaying your own reunion. There is a reason this message found you today. Not yesterday. Not next week. Today. Archangel Michael wants you to understand something that most people never recognize until it is too late. Your twin flame timeline is beginning to open. And whenever heaven begins to unlock what has been delayed for years, an invisible battle often intensifies before the breakthrough becomes visible. If you've recently felt unusually exhausted, even after sleeping. If people have suddenly turned against you without explanation. If old relationships, painful memories, or unexpected temptations have resurfaced just when you thought you had finally moved on. Do not dismiss these moments as random coincidence. Something deeper may be unfolding. Because there is a spiritual principle that has repeated itself throughout countless awakening journeys. Resistance often grows strongest just before divine alignment arrives. Think about that for a moment. Why is it that the moment someone decides to heal, old wounds suddenly become louder? Why is it that when someone commits to peace, chaos seems determined to interrupt it? Why do opportunities appear alongside confusion? Why do hope and fear often arrive at the same doorway? Perhaps because every transformation asks one final question before it begins. Will you protect what heaven is preparing? Archangel Michael is often described as the protector, the guardian who stands between light and forces that seek to create fear, confusion, and discouragement. Whether you understand this symbolically or spiritually, the message remains the same. There are seasons in life when your greatest responsibility is not to chase your destiny. It is to guard the condition of your heart while destiny quietly approaches. Many chosen ones believe they must constantly search for signs that their twin flame is near. They watch numbers. They analyze dreams. They replay conversations. They wonder whether every coincidence carries hidden meaning. Yet Michael's warning shifts your attention somewhere entirely different. He says, protect your energy first, because what enters your life next will grow inside the atmosphere you create today. Imagine preparing a beautiful garden. Would you spend every hour searching for seeds? Or would you first remove the weeds? Would you worry about when the flowers will bloom? Or would you prepare the soil that will one day receive them? The answer seems obvious. Yet spiritually, many people reverse the process. They become obsessed with finding the right person while neglecting the inner environment that love will eventually inhabit. The divine timeline is not simply about meeting someone. It is about becoming someone capable of sustaining what heaven has prepared. That is why this season feels different. You may have noticed yourself pulling away from conversations that once entertained you. You may feel strangely uncomfortable around constant negativity. Perhaps certain friendships no longer resonate the way they once did. Maybe your intuition has become stronger, warning you before situations unfold. These changes are not necessarily signs that something is wrong. Sometimes they are evidence that something within you is changing faster than your surroundings. Growth often feels lonely before it feels rewarding, and loneliness can easily be mistaken for failure. But what if your isolation has actually been preparation? What if the silence you've been resisting has become sacred space? Think about an archer for a moment. Before an arrow flies forward, it must first be pulled backward. To someone unfamiliar with archery, that backward movement might appear like defeat. It looks like retreat, like delay, like lost progress. Yet the very force pulling the arrow backward becomes the force that launches it farther than it could have traveled on its own. Many chosen ones are living inside that backward pull. They see relationships ending, plans collapsing, friendships fading, dreams delayed, and they assume life is moving away from them. But perhaps life has been positioning them. Perhaps heaven has been stretching the bow. Perhaps what feels like delay is actually stored momentum. This is why Michael's warning is so urgent. Not because you should become afraid, but because fear itself is often the distraction. Notice how fear speaks. It whispers, "What if nothing changes? What if you've imagined everything? What if you wait forever? What if you've already missed your chance?" Fear rarely screams. It quietly repeats itself until uncertainty begins to sound like truth. Michael calls you to recognize that voice, not to fight it with panic, but to answer it with awareness. Because awareness changes everything. When you realize that not every thought deserves your agreement. When you realize that not every emotion deserves your obedience. When you realize that temporary discouragement does not define permanent destiny. You begin protecting your energy in an entirely new way. Protection is not building walls around your heart. It is becoming wise about what receives access to your attention. Attention is one of the greatest forms of spiritual currency. Whatever consistently captures your attention gradually shapes your inner world. Constant fear creates fearful expectations. Constant comparison creates dissatisfaction. Constant resentment slowly poisons hope. But constant gratitude, constant faith, constant inner stillness, these quietly transform the atmosphere within you. An atmosphere matters. Imagine walking into two different homes. The furniture might be nearly identical. The lighting may be similar. Yet one home immediately feels peaceful. The other feels heavy. Nothing visible explains the difference. But almost everyone can sense it. People carry spiritual atmospheres in much the same way. Some carry peace. Some carry anxiety. Some carry constant conflict. Some carry quiet confidence. The question Michael asks is not simply, "When will your twin flame arrive?" His deeper question is, what atmosphere will they encounter when they do? Will they meet someone consumed by fear? Or someone strengthened through surrender? Will they find someone exhausted by chasing certainty? Or someone resting in divine timing? This is why protecting your energy becomes an act of preparation rather than isolation. It means choosing peace over unnecessary arguments. Choosing forgiveness instead of bitterness. Choosing discernment over emotional reaction. Choosing quiet confidence over desperate control. These choices may appear small, but every small choice becomes another brick in the foundation of your future. You don't build a cathedral in one day. You place one stone after another. The same is true spiritually. Every prayer matters. Every act of self-respect matters. Every moment you refuse to return to what once broke you matters. Every time you choose healing instead of revenge, you strengthen the life you are preparing to enter. And perhaps this explains something you've secretly wondered. Why have certain people become strangely distant? Why have some opportunities disappeared just as you reached for them? Why have familiar comforts suddenly lost their appeal? Could it be that heaven is gently removing what no longer belongs in your next chapter? Not everything that leaves your life is a punishment. Sometimes it is protection wearing the disguise of loss. Sometimes closed doors preserve open destinies. And sometimes the greatest miracle is not what enters your life. It is what quietly exits before it can delay your purpose. So if you have felt unusually sensitive lately, if your intuition keeps telling you to slow down, if your spirit longs for more silence than noise, do not ignore those gentle promptings. The opening of a divine timeline is rarely announced with fireworks. More often, it begins with subtle invitations. An unexpected peace. A growing clarity. A quiet release of old burdens. A feeling that something is changing, even though you cannot yet explain what. That is why Michael's message today is simple. Protect your energy. Guard your peace. Do not allow temporary distractions to convince you that permanent promises have disappeared. Because the very fact that resistance has increased may not be evidence that you are moving away from your destiny. It may be the first sign that you are closer than you have ever been before. And in the next chapter, we will uncover why so many chosen ones mistake their deepest wounds for abandonment, when those very wounds may have been preparing them for the reunion they have been praying for all along. Before anything else unfolds, there is something Archangel Michael wants you to hear clearly. Not as judgment, not as punishment, but as recognition. Nothing you have been through was meaningless. If you have felt like life has been unusually heavy lately, if you've questioned whether people truly understand you, if you've ever sat in silence and wondered why your efforts to love, to give, or to do the right thing still ended in disappointment, then this message is not arriving by accident. Because what you are experiencing is not just emotional exhaustion. It is what happens when a soul begins to outgrow the environment it was once forced to survive in. And that process rarely feels comfortable. In fact, it often feels like being misunderstood by almost everyone at once. You may have noticed something strange in your recent relationships. People you trusted may have suddenly disappointed you. Conversations that once felt easy may now feel distant or forced. You might even find yourself thinking, why do I feel so alone, even when I am surrounded by people? That question alone is a sign of awakening. Because loneliness in this phase is not always about physical isolation. It is about energetic misalignment. You are no longer resonating with the same emotional frequency as before. And that creates a gap that words cannot easily fill. Archangel Michael calls this a form of spiritual separation before alignment. But in human experience, it often feels like rejection. Especially when it comes from the people closest to you. Think about the moments that hurt the most. Was it always strangers? Or was it the people you believed would never turn away from you? Family members who did not understand your choices. Friends who dismissed your intuition. Partners who misunderstood your depth. Or perhaps you were the one who always gave more. And received less clarity, less consistency, less emotional safety in return. Over time, something inside you began to change. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. But quietly. Like a door closing in a room you didn't even realize was open. You began to question things you once accepted. You started to notice patterns you used to ignore. You stopped explaining yourself as much. And in that silence, something powerful began to form. Self-awareness. But self-awareness in its early stages often feels like alienation. Because once you start seeing clearly, you can no longer unsee what hurts you. And that is where many chosen ones find themselves now. Between two worlds. One version of life where they used to belong. And another version that is still forming, but not yet fully visible. This in-between space is uncomfortable. It does not reward certainty. It tests patience. It challenges emotional endurance. And most importantly, it forces you to confront a truth most people avoid. Not everyone who was present in your past is meant to walk into your future. That realization alone can feel like grief. Even if no one physically left. Even if nothing dramatic happened. Sometimes the deepest loss is not separation. It is awareness. Awareness that a connection you once believed in may have been built on imbalance. Awareness that your loyalty was not always matched with understanding. Awareness that your silence was often mistaken for acceptance. And yet, even in that pain, Archangel Michael brings a different perspective. He says, "You were never meant to shrink yourself to stay connected." Let that sit for a moment. Because many chosen ones have spent years adjusting themselves for environments that were never designed for their emotional truth. You learned to be patient when you wanted clarity. You learned to be understanding when you needed honesty. You learned to stay quiet when you needed to be heard. And over time, those patterns became familiar. Almost normal. But familiarity does not always equal alignment. Sometimes it simply means endurance. And endurance, while powerful, is not the same as fulfillment. That is why recent emotional shifts may feel so intense. You are no longer willing to abandon yourself just to preserve connection. And that decision changes everything. It changes how you respond. It changes what you tolerate. It changes what you walk away from. And yes, it changes how others perceive you. Because people who were used to your old version may not recognize the new one. The version that pauses before overgiving. The version that questions inconsistency. The version that no longer confuses intensity with love. And when that recognition gap appears, misunderstanding often follows. Some people may think you have changed, but in truth, you are simply returning to yourself. Still, that return process is rarely celebrated by everyone. Sometimes it is resisted. Sometimes it is criticized. Sometimes it is met with silence. And that silence can feel painful. But Archangel Michael reminds you of something essential. Misunderstanding is not rejection of your worth. It is evidence of transition. Because not everyone is meant to understand who you are becoming. Some people are only familiar with who you used to be. And there is a difference between those two versions of you that cannot always be bridged by explanation. This is also why certain emotional wounds keep resurfacing. You might think you have healed something, only for it to appear again in a different form. A different person. A different situation. A different trigger. But the same emotional lesson underneath. This is not punishment. It is pattern exposure. Life is not trying to break you. It is trying to show you what still pulls you away from your peace. And every time you recognize a pattern without repeating it, something shifts internally. You become less reactive, more grounded, more aware, more intentional. And that awareness slowly begins to reshape your reality. But before that transformation stabilizes, there is often a phase where everything feels uncertain, where old support systems weaken, where emotional comfort becomes inconsistent, where you feel like you are walking without full clarity. This is the phase where many people assume something is wrong. But Archangel Michael frames it differently. He says, "You are not losing your life. You are losing what cannot come with you." That distinction is everything. Because when you interpret loss incorrectly, you enter fear. But when you interpret it correctly, you enter preparation. And preparation changes how you walk through pain. Instead of resisting it, you begin to observe it. Instead of panicking, you begin to understand it. Instead of collapsing into confusion, you begin to recognize direction. Even your emotional sensitivity begins to make sense. Why certain environments feel heavier than before. Why certain conversations drain you more quickly. Why your intuition reacts faster than your logic can explain. These are not signs of weakness. They are signs of refinement. Your inner world is becoming more precise, less tolerant of distortion, more sensitive to truth. And that sensitivity is what prepares you for alignment. Because true connection does not require you to ignore your intuition. It requires you to trust it. So if you have felt misunderstood, if you have felt emotionally stretched, if you have felt like you are walking away from things you once depended on, know this. You are not breaking down. You are breaking through layers that no longer represent who you are becoming. And even though it may feel like isolation, it is actually recalibration. A silent realignment taking place beneath the surface of your life. In the next chapter, we will uncover why these painful endings are not random losses, but carefully orchestrated removals that are preparing space for something far more aligned than what was ever possible in your past. There is something Archangel Michael wants you to understand at a deeper level now. Something that cannot be fully explained through logic alone, because it unfolds in the space between what you feel and what you cannot yet see. And it is this. Not everything that feels like resistance is your enemy. And not everything that feels like confusion is random. In fact, right before a twin flame timeline opens, many chosen ones experience a very specific pattern. It is subtle at first. almost unnoticeable. Then suddenly it becomes impossible to ignore. You begin to feel like life is pulling you in two directions at once. One part of you feels ready to grow, to heal, to move forward. But another part of you feels strangely stuck in old emotions, old memories, old attachments you thought you had already released. It can feel like regression, like something is undoing your progress, like you are being pulled backward just as you were starting to move forward. But Archangel Michael describes this differently. He calls it the final distortion phase before alignment. Because before anything divine stabilizes in your life, there is often a last attempt from your old energetic patterns to regain control. Not because they are stronger, but because they are losing access. Think of it like this. When a door that has been open for a long time begins to close, there is often a moment where everything around it shifts. Air moves differently. Light changes direction. Even sounds feel slightly distorted. It is not chaos. It is transition. And in transition, things that once had easy access begin to struggle. This is what many chosen ones are feeling right now. You may have noticed thoughts that feel unusually intrusive. Doubt that appears without reason. Sudden waves of nostalgia for people you had already emotionally moved on from. Unexpected dreams that reopen emotional doors you thought were closed. Moments where you question your own intuition, even though it has been guiding you clearly for months. And perhaps the most confusing part, these feelings do not always match your current reality. There is no logical trigger, no visible cause, no clear explanation, and yet they still appear. This is why so many people mistake this phase for going backward. But Archangel Michael offers a different interpretation. He says, you are not regressing, you are being exposed to what still has emotional access to you. There is a difference between healing something and being completely untouched by it. Healing does not mean the absence of memory. It means the loss of emotional control. But before that control fully dissolves, there is often a final resurfacing. Not to trap you, but to reveal what still has influence over your energy. Imagine cleaning a room that has been closed for years. At first, everything seems fine when you open the door. But as light enters the space, dust becomes visible. Not because the dust just appeared, but because visibility has changed. This is what is happening spiritually. Light is increasing in your awareness. And with that increase, hidden emotional residue becomes visible again. Some of it may feel like past heartbreak returning. Some of it may feel like unresolved conversations replaying in your mind. Some of it may even feel like temptation to revisit connections you already knew were not aligned. And in those moments, confusion often whispers. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I should go back. Maybe this isn't finished yet. But Archangel Michael encourages discernment here. Because not every emotional replay is a sign to revisit something. Sometimes it is a final echo before release. There is also another layer to this battle that many do not recognize. When your energy begins shifting toward a twin flame alignment, your nervous system itself starts recalibrating. This recalibration can feel uncomfortable. Not because something is wrong, but because your internal system is adjusting to a new frequency of emotional stability. Old emotional habits were built around survival patterns. Reacting quickly. Seeking validation. Over-explaining. Over-giving. Anticipating rejection. Avoiding abandonment. These patterns once helped you navigate emotional uncertainty. But now they are being rewritten. And anything being rewritten often resists at first. This is why you may feel moments of internal contradiction. You want peace, but part of you still reacts to chaos. You want clarity, but part of you still entertains confusion. You want alignment, but part of you still remembers imbalance. This does not mean you are failing. It means integration is happening. But integration is not always smooth. It can feel like tension between two versions of yourself. The version that survived your past, and the version that is learning how to live beyond it. And this internal tension is often projected outward. Suddenly, people may behave unpredictably around you. Some may withdraw without explanation. Others may reappear unexpectedly. Some may test your emotional boundaries without realizing it. Not because they are consciously doing harm, but because your energetic shift changes how you are perceived in their presence. When you change internally, external dynamics naturally adjust. And this adjustment period can feel unstable. But instability is not the same as danger. It is often just unfamiliar structure forming. Archangel Michael describes this as the recalibration of relational energy fields. In simpler terms, your old emotional environment is no longer fully compatible with your new frequency. And so, everything around you begins to reorganize itself. Some connections stabilize. Some fade. Some intensify briefly before dissolving. And through it all, your role is not to chase clarity through panic. It is to observe without attachment. Because attachment is often what feeds confusion during transition. There is also something deeper happening in this phase that few recognize. Your intuition becomes louder. But your doubt becomes louder too. And when both voices speak at once, it can feel like internal conflict. But Archangel Michael reveals something important here. Intuition does not compete. It remains consistent. Doubt fluctuates. It reacts. It amplifies fear. So when you feel confusion, the question is not, what do I feel right now? But rather, what has remained true across time? Because truth is not unstable. It does not change shape every time emotion shifts. It stays grounded, even when feelings fluctuate. This is why protection of your energy is not just about avoiding negativity externally. It is about stabilizing your internal reference point, so that external fluctuations do not become internal confusion. And as this stabilization continues, something very important begins to happen quietly. You stop reacting to everything. You begin to pause before responding. You become more aware of what drains you versus what strengthens you. You start noticing that some conversations feel heavier than others. Some environments feel clearer than others. Some memories no longer carry emotional weight they once had. This is not detachment in the cold sense. It is emotional clarity emerging. And clarity is the foundation of alignment. Because when confusion decreases, discernment increases. And when discernment increases, you stop entertaining what no longer belongs in your path. That is when the spiritual battle begins to shift. Not because challenges disappear, but because you stop feeding the cycles that create unnecessary struggle. And slowly, something else begins to take its place. A sense of quiet knowing. Even if everything is not yet fully visible. Even if the path is not completely revealed. There is still a deeper trust forming within you. And that trust becomes the beginning of alignment. In the next chapter, we will uncover how these hidden shifts are not random emotional turbulence, but carefully orchestrated preparation for the moment your twin flame timeline begins to stabilize into physical reality. There comes a moment in every chosen one's journey when the confusion begins to dissolve, not because life suddenly becomes easier, but because perception finally becomes clearer. Archangel Michael wants you to understand something very important in this chapter. Something that may reframe everything you have lived through. Not as punishment, not as abandonment, but as preparation. Because what if the very things that broke your heart were also breaking the path open for something you were not yet ready to receive? Take a deep breath as you receive this truth. Nothing was random. Nothing was wasted. And nothing was truly taken away without purpose. What you experienced as loss was often the removal of interference. What you experienced as rejection was often redirection. What you experienced as endings were often initiations. And now, as your twin flame timeline begins to open, those endings begin to make a different kind of sense. Not emotional sense. Spiritual sense. There is a difference. Emotional sense asks, why did this happen to me? Spiritual sense asks, what was this preparing me for? And Archangel Michael gently shifts your awareness toward the second question. Because the first keeps you anchored in pain, but the second begins to unlock understanding. Let's go deeper. Many chosen ones believe that divine connection arrives through addition. that someone must enter their life in order for things to improve. But in truth, the twin flame path often begins with subtraction. People leave. Patterns collapse. Attachments dissolve. Comfort zones break down. And the ego interprets this as loss. But the soul interprets it as clearing. Think of a crowded room filled with noise. Too many voices. Too many overlapping emotions. Too many expectations pulling you in different directions. Now imagine trying to hear one soft, meaningful voice in that chaos. It becomes nearly impossible. So what happens when clarity is required? The noise must decrease. This is what your life has been experiencing. A gradual reduction of interference. Not to isolate you, but to attune you. Because the frequency of divine alignment cannot be clearly perceived in emotional clutter. This is why certain relationships could not continue into your next chapter. Not because they lacked meaning, but because they lacked alignment with your evolution. Some connections were karmic. Some were educational. Some were deeply emotional but not spiritually compatible with your next phase. And this is where Archangel Michael's message becomes very direct. Not every connection is meant to evolve with you. Some are meant to complete their role. And completion can feel like loss when you are still emotionally attached to the form it once took. But completion is not destruction. It is fulfillment of purpose. Now, as your twin flame timeline opens, you may begin to notice something strange. Old cycles feel more distant. Emotional triggers that once controlled you lose intensity. Memories that once pulled you into spirals begin to lose their grip. And yet, simultaneously, new emotional awareness begins to emerge. You feel more sensitive to energy, more aware of emotional dishonesty, more intuitive about people's intentions. At times, even before words are spoken, you can sense shifts in atmosphere. This is not imagination. It is energetic refinement. And refinement always precedes alignment. Because before two twin flame energies can meet in physical reality, both must exist in a state that no longer distorts love through fear. This is why your journey has not been linear. It has been layered, stripping away illusions, revealing emotional truths, forcing you to confront patterns that once defined your relationships. And now, Archangel Michael reveals something deeper. Your twin flame connection was never absent. It was being synchronized beyond what your awareness could perceive. This means that while your human experience felt like waiting, your spiritual experience was actually unfolding in parallel. Healing, alignment, distance correction, timing synchronization, emotional purification, all occurring beneath the surface of visible reality. Think of two clocks in different rooms. At first, they do not match. One is ahead. One is behind. But over time, through consistent calibration, both slowly begin to align. Not instantly. Not dramatically. But steadily. This is what divine timing looks like. And the delay you have experienced was not a denial of connection. It was synchronization. Because if you had met your twin flame before this inner alignment occurred, the connection would have activated unresolved wounds rather than healed union. And that would have created repetition instead of harmony. Archangel Michael emphasizes this clearly. Union without inner alignment becomes repetition. Union with alignment becomes transformation. This is why certain relationships in your past may have felt intense but unstable. Strong emotional attraction, deep connection, but recurring misunderstandings, inconsistency, emotional imbalance. Those experiences were not failures. They were indicators. They showed you what love without alignment feels like. So that when aligned love arrives, you will recognize the difference instantly. Now, as your timeline shifts, you may begin to experience moments of unexpected emotional clarity. You no longer chase closure from people who cannot give it. You no longer seek validation from those who do not understand you. You no longer confuse intensity with destiny. Instead, you begin to recognize something more subtle. Peace. Consistency. Emotional neutrality toward past chaos. And that neutrality is powerful. because it means the emotional charge of your past no longer controls your present. This is one of the final stages before twin flame alignment becomes physically noticeable. Not dramatic transformation, but internal stillness. Because stillness is where recognition becomes possible. When emotional turbulence decreases, intuition becomes clearer. When intuition becomes clearer, misalignment becomes obvious. And when misalignment becomes obvious, you stop choosing what cannot support your next level. This is how space is created. Not through force, but through awareness. And space is essential. Because divine union does not enter a life already filled with unresolved noise. It enters a life that has been prepared to receive it. This is why Archangel Michael frames your past differently than you might have understood it before. He says, "Nothing left you. It completed its purpose around you." That shift in perception changes everything. Because it removes victimhood from your story and replaces it with purpose. Even the most painful experiences begin to transform in meaning. The betrayal that once broke your trust becomes the lesson that rebuilt your discernment. The abandonment that once shattered your security becomes the foundation of your independence. The confusion that once overwhelmed you becomes the catalyst for inner clarity. And now, all of it begins to converge toward one truth. You are being prepared for a connection that requires emotional maturity, not emotional dependency. A connection that requires clarity, not confusion. A connection that cannot survive in the same conditions that once destabilized your past relationships. And so, the clearing had to happen. Even if it felt painful. Even if it felt unnecessary at the time. Even if you could not see the purpose while living through it. Now, however, something new begins to emerge. A sense that your life is reorganizing itself quietly. Not loudly. Not suddenly. But intentionally. People from your past feel further away emotionally. Old patterns no longer resonate the same way. You feel less interested in returning to what once consumed your attention, and more drawn toward simplicity, stillness, truth. This is the beginning of stabilization. And stabilization is the final phase before recognition becomes reality. Because when your inner world stabilizes, your outer world begins to mirror that stability. And when both align, the twin flame timeline stops feeling like a distant concept and starts becoming a lived experience. In the next and final chapter, we will explore how to protect this emerging alignment and step fully into the activation of your divine connection without falling back into the energetic patterns that once delayed your journey. Now you have reached a threshold many people never consciously arrive at. Not because they are unworthy, but because they miss the moment where awareness becomes action. Archangel Michael brings you here with a final message, not as a warning of danger, but as a reminder of responsibility. Because when a twin flame timeline begins to stabilize, the most important phase is not discovery anymore. It is protection. Protection of your energy. Protection of your clarity. Protection of the frequency you have been carefully rebuilding. And Michael wants you to understand something very clearly. What you allow into your energy field now will determine whether your alignment stabilizes or collapses back into confusion. This is the activation phase. And activation is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is not chaotic. It is subtle, almost invisible at first. You begin to notice small shifts. You no longer react the way you used to. You pause before emotional decisions. You feel less compelled to explain yourself. You are less available for emotional instability. And yet, paradoxically, your sensitivity increases. You can feel energy more precisely than before. You can sense when something is off, even without words. You can tell when someone's intentions do not match their presence. This is not overthinking. It is refinement. And refinement is the language of activation. But here is the danger Archangel Michael gently reveals. Once clarity begins to return, old patterns will attempt to re-enter your field disguised as familiarity. That is why protection is no longer optional. It becomes essential. Because the very same energy that once pulled you into confusion may try to return just as you begin to stabilize. And it may not return loudly. It may return softly. Through nostalgia. Through sudden memories. Through people from the past reappearing by coincidence. Through emotional moments that feel strangely familiar. And in those moments you may feel a subtle pull. Maybe this time it will be different. But Michael asks you to pause before responding to emotional familiarity. Because familiarity is not always alignment. Sometimes it is simply memory trying to regain emotional access. And access is exactly what must now be protected. Think of your energy like a sacred space that has finally been cleaned after years of emotional chaos. Would you invite dust back in just because it once lived there? Would you reopen old doors just because they were once part of your story? Or would you guard the stillness you fought so hard to create? This is the question of activation. And your answer determines everything. Now, Archangel Michael gives you practical spiritual guidance for this phase, not rules but awareness principles. First, protect your attention. Because attention is the bridge between thought and energy. Whatever you repeatedly focus on begins to shape your emotional reality. If you focus on confusion, confusion expands. If you focus on fear, fear deepens. But if you focus on clarity, clarity strengthens. This is why distraction becomes more intense just before alignment stabilizes. Because attention is being tested. Second, protect your emotional boundaries. You do not need to respond to everything. You do not need to explain every feeling. You do not need to re-enter every conversation that drains your peace. Silence in this phase is not avoidance. It is preservation. Third, protect your inner narrative. Because what you tell yourself during transition matters more than external events. If you repeatedly tell yourself that you are lost, your perception will follow that belief. But if you remind yourself that you are being aligned, even without full visibility, you anchor stability into uncertainty. And stability is what prevents regression. Now let's address something deeper. As your twin flame timeline activates, you may also notice moments of emotional intensity returning unexpectedly. Old wounds may briefly surface. Not to destabilize you, but to test whether they still control you. For example, a situation may arise that resembles a past betrayal. A conversation may trigger an old abandonment feeling. A memory may suddenly feel emotionally vivid again. But Archangel Michael reframes these moments clearly. This is not relapse. This is confirmation of release. Because when something no longer has control over you, it often appears one last time to confirm that it no longer defines you. And your response in that moment determines your level of alignment. Do you react? Or do you observe? Do you spiral into old emotion? Or do you recognize the pattern and remain centered? This is where activation becomes real. Not in theory, but in behavior. Because spiritual alignment is not just what you believe. It is how you respond when old energy attempts to re-enter your field. Now, Archangel Michael reveals something very important about your twin flame. They are not arriving into a chaotic version of your life. They are aligning with the version of you that has learned how to hold peace in the middle of uncertainty. This means your preparation is not just about waiting. It is about becoming. Becoming someone who no longer abandons themselves emotionally. Becoming someone who does not confuse intensity with love. Becoming someone who can recognize alignment without fear or desperation. Because the twin flame connection is not sustained by emotional dependency. It is sustained by emotional sovereignty. And sovereignty means you are whole even before union arrives. Now, as this chapter deepens, Michael asks you to understand something that may shift your entire perspective. You are not waiting for your twin flame to complete you. You are becoming someone who can meet them without losing yourself. That is the activation. And it is already happening. You may feel it in moments of unexpected calm. You may notice it when you choose peace over reaction. You may recognize it when you no longer chase closure from people who cannot give clarity. You may feel it when your energy naturally pulls away from chaos without effort. These are not small changes. They are structural changes in your emotional system. And structural changes cannot be reversed easily. They only strengthen over time, if protected. Which brings us to the final message of Archangel Michael in this chapter. Guard what is stabilizing inside you. Because the greatest threat to alignment is not external interference. It is internal abandonment. The moment you abandon your own clarity to return to confusion, you interrupt the activation process. But the moment you choose your peace, even when it is uncomfortable, you reinforce it. And reinforcement leads to permanence. So if you are feeling sensitive right now, if you are noticing shifts in your intuition, if your emotional world feels both clearer and more fragile at the same time, understand this. You are not breaking down. You are locking into a frequency that can sustain what is coming. And what is coming is not confusion, not chaos, but recognition. Because when both twin flame energies stabilize, distance stops being separation and becomes preparation for meeting. And in that meeting, nothing about your past confusion will matter anymore. Only your alignment will. So protect it, honor it, and allow it to become strong enough to hold what heaven has already begun to open in your life. Now you arrive at the final stage of this message. Not because the journey ends here, but because something inside you is ready to begin living differently from this point forward. Archangel Michael does not come with dramatic announcements in this moment. There are no loud warnings anymore. No chaotic disturbances meant to shake your foundation. Instead, there is something much quieter. Something far more powerful. Recognition. And recognition is what happens when confusion finally stops interrupting clarity. Take a moment and notice something within yourself right now. You are not the same person who began this message. Something has shifted. Not externally, but internally. Subtly. Quietly. You may not even be able to name it yet, but you feel it. A sense of distance from old emotional chaos. A softening of fear that once felt constant. A clearer awareness of what no longer belongs in your life. This is not imagination. This is alignment beginning to stabilize. Archangel Michael calls this phase the quiet arrival of truth. Because truth does not enter loudly. It does not force itself. It does not overwhelm. It settles. Like morning light slowly filling a room that was once dark. Now, as your twin flame timeline fully activates into awareness, something very important happens. You stop searching in panic. And you start observing in peace. This shift may seem small, but it is actually monumental. Because panic is what distorts perception. And peace is what restores it. In the past, you may have tried to decode everything. Signs. Synchronicities. Patterns. Memories. Emotional triggers. You may have asked yourself countless times, is this it? Is this person the one? Is this feeling real? But Archangel Michael now reveals something that changes the entire foundation of those questions. Real alignment does not require constant questioning. It creates internal certainty even in external uncertainty. This does not mean every doubt disappears. It means doubt no longer controls your direction. And that difference is everything. Because when doubt loses authority, clarity begins to lead. Now you begin to notice a new emotional landscape forming within you. You are less reactive, less emotionally entangled in chaos, less drawn to situations that once felt familiar but unstable, and more drawn to stillness, simplicity, truth without distortion. At times, you may even feel emotionally detached from your past self, as if you are observing a version of you that once survived things you no longer resonate with. This is not disconnection. It is integration completing itself. And integration is what allows you to move forward without carrying emotional fragmentation. Archangel Michael explains this clearly. You are not losing who you were. You are no longer controlled by who you were forced to become. And this distinction is what makes room for something new to enter your field. Now, in this final stage, something subtle but profound begins to happen. People from your past may still appear in your thoughts, but they no longer hold emotional power. Situations that once triggered anxiety may still be remembered, but they no longer destabilize you. Old patterns may briefly echo, but they do not take root. This is emotional neutrality. And emotional neutrality is one of the clearest signs that your twin flame timeline is stabilizing. Because neutrality means your energy is no longer being pulled backward. It is no longer entangled in unresolved emotional loops. It is becoming free. And freedom is the condition required for true alignment. Now Archangel Michael brings your attention to something even deeper. The twin flame connection you have been guided toward is not arriving as a rescue. It is arriving as recognition. Not completion of lack, but reflection of wholeness. This means something very important. Your twin flame does not enter your life to fix you. They enter your life to meet you where you have already become whole. This is why everything you experienced was necessary. Because without emotional healing, without release of past attachment, without breaking cycles of dependency, recognition would not be stable. It would become repetition. But now repetition is dissolving. And in its place, something far more grounded is forming. A connection that does not rely on emotional chaos to feel alive. A bond that does not require suffering to feel meaningful. A union that does not confuse intensity with destiny. Instead, it feels like clarity, even if it arrives quietly, even if it does not match the dramatic expectations the mind once held. Because true alignment rarely feels like fantasy. It feels like peace that remains steady even when life is uncertain. And that peace is what signals arrival. Not necessarily physical arrival yet, but energetic arrival. The point where both timelines begin to synchronize into the same field of possibility. And as this synchronization strengthens, you may begin to notice something unusual. You stop needing to force outcomes. You stop trying to predict timing. You stop obsessing over when. Because something within you begins to understand. What is aligned does not need to be chased. It needs to be received. And receiving requires stillness. Not effort. Not control. But openness without desperation. Archangel Michael emphasizes this final teaching clearly. The final stage of alignment is not pursuit. It is surrender without fear. And surrender is often misunderstood. It is not giving up. It is no longer resisting what is already unfolding. Now, as this chapter reaches its deepest point, there is one final truth to anchor into your awareness. Your twin flame timeline is not something you are trying to reach. It is something you are becoming compatible with. And compatibility is not created through urgency. It is created through transformation. This is why everything you experienced had to happen in sequence. The loss, the confusion, the isolation, the emotional recalibration, the spiritual battle, the activation. Each phase was not separate. It was a continuation of one unfolding process, bringing you into alignment with what cannot exist in chaos. And now, as that process stabilizes, something quietly opens within you. Not a door you can physically see, but a state of being you can feel. A sense that your life is no longer moving randomly. A sense that even delays have structure. A sense that even silence has meaning. And most importantly, a sense that you are no longer disconnected from your path. You are inside it. Fully. Finally. And from here, Archangel Michael leaves you with this final reflection. You will not recognize your twin flame through searching. You will recognize them through alignment. Because recognition is not mental. It is energetic. It is the meeting of two frequencies that no longer contradict each other. So continue to protect what you have built. Continue to honor the clarity that is formed within you. Continue to choose peace over confusion. Because what is approaching does not respond to chaos. It responds to alignment. And in that alignment, something long prepared across time begins to quietly arrive. Not as a storm, but as recognition. Not as confusion, but as certainty. And not as a question, but as the beginning of a life that finally feels like it has found its place. At this point in your journey, something fundamental has already changed, even if life around you still looks familiar. Archangel Michael does not bring you another warning here. He brings you integration. Because activation is not the final destination. Integration is. Activation opens the door. Integration teaches you how to live through it without collapsing back into old patterns. And this is where many chosen ones unknowingly pause in their growth. Not because they are failing, but because this phase feels deceptively ordinary. There are no dramatic signs. No overwhelming synchronicities every hour. No emotional extremes pulling you in every direction. Instead, there is something quieter. Something more grounded. A steady internal presence that does not disappear even when external uncertainty remains. This is the beginning of embodied alignment. And Archangel Michael calls this stage the return to yourself. Not the version of you shaped by survival. Not the version of you formed through emotional chaos. But the version of you that exists beneath all conditioning, fear, and attachment. The version that was always there waiting. Now you begin to notice subtle but profound changes in how you move through life. Situations that once triggered anxiety no longer have the same emotional charge. People who once held power over your emotions now feel distant in meaning, even if they are physically present. Old questions that used to consume your mind begin to lose urgency. Not because they were answered, but because they are no longer necessary. This is one of the clearest signs of integration. You stop needing emotional resolution to feel at peace. Instead of chasing clarity, you embody it. Instead of seeking reassurance, you return to inner stability. Instead of reacting to uncertainty, you observe it. And in that observation, something powerful happens. You are no longer inside the emotional storm. You are aware of it, but not controlled by it. Archangel Michael explains this shift as the separation between awareness and reaction. And once that separation stabilizes, your entire experience of life changes. You begin to live from a quieter center. A place where external events no longer dictate internal stability. Now, this is where your twin flame timeline becomes less about anticipation and more about presence. Because presence is what sustains alignment. In the past, your energy may have been directed outward, toward searching, questioning, interpreting, and hoping. But now your energy begins to turn inward. Not in isolation, but in grounding. You become more aware of how you feel before reacting. More conscious of what drains or nourishes you. More selective with your attention. More intentional with your emotional availability. And this shift is not small. It is structural. It changes the way you interact with reality itself. Because reality responds differently to a stabilized energy field. Where there was once inconsistency, there is now clarity. Where there was once emotional fragmentation, there is now coherence. And coherence is what allows deeper alignment to hold. At this stage, Archangel Michael emphasizes something very important. You are no longer preparing for the twin flame connection. You are maintaining the frequency that allows it to remain stable. This is a subtle but powerful distinction. Preparation implies something missing. Maintenance implies something already established. And what is established now is your internal alignment. Not perfect. Not complete in the human sense. But stable enough to hold higher connection without losing yourself in it. Now you may notice something else happening. Your past no longer feels like a place you are emotionally tied to. It becomes a reference point instead of a residence. Memories still exist, but they no longer pull you backward. You can observe them without re-entering them. This is emotional maturity at the energetic level. And it is one of the final stages before physical alignment begins to reflect your internal state. Archangel Michael explains this clearly. Your outer life cannot maintain what your inner life no longer sustains. This means that as your internal field stabilizes, external reality begins to reorganize itself accordingly. Not instantly, but naturally. Relationships adjust. Opportunities shift. Timing aligns. And what is meant for you begins to feel less like a chase and more like recognition. Now, let's address something many chosen ones quietly wonder about in this stage. If I'm already aligned, why hasn't everything physically manifested yet? The answer is subtle. Because integration is not only about inner change. It is also about energetic synchronization between two paths. Your twin flame journey is not unfolding on a single timeline. It is unfolding across two lives, two emotional systems, two healing processes. And while your awareness may feel ready, the connection itself is still stabilizing across both experiences. Think of two rivers slowly converging. At first, they flow separately. Then gradually, their currents begin to influence each other. Not by force, but by proximity. Eventually, they become one stream. But that merging is not instant. It is gradual alignment of flow. This is what is happening in your life now. And your role is not to accelerate it. Your role is to remain in coherence while it unfolds. Which brings us to one of the most important teachings of this chapter. Alignment is not maintained through effort. It is maintained through awareness. Effort creates tension. Awareness creates clarity. And clarity allows flow. So instead of trying to do more, you are invited to hold more awareness. Awareness of your emotions. Awareness of your triggers. Awareness of your reactions. Awareness of your energy shifts throughout the day. Because when you observe yourself clearly, you naturally correct misalignment without force. Now, Archangel Michael also reveals something essential about love in this stage. Real connection does not create confusion. It reveals it. And anything that creates consistent confusion is not alignment, it is distortion. This does not mean you will never feel uncertainty. It means uncertainty no longer defines your emotional state. It passes through you, instead of living inside you. And this is what allows deeper connection to eventually enter your reality without destabilizing your foundation. Because you are no longer building from emotional dependence. You are building from emotional wholeness. Now, as integration deepens, something very beautiful begins to happen quietly. You begin to feel grateful for everything you once questioned. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. The moments you once called loss become redirections. The silence you once called abandonment becomes protection. The delays you once called confusion become alignment timing. And in that shift of perception, something profound stabilizes. Peace without explanation. Not because everything is resolved, but because everything is understood at a deeper level. This is what Archangel Michael refers to as spiritual maturity. And spiritual maturity is not emotional perfection. It is emotional understanding without emotional dependence. Now, as this final chapter settles, there is one last truth to anchor into your awareness. Your twin flame timeline is no longer something ahead of you. It is something that is unfolding through you. Through your choices. Through your awareness. Through your ability to remain aligned even when life feels uncertain. And this is why everything you experienced mattered. Because without those experiences, you would not have developed the inner stability required for this level of connection. So as you move forward from here, Archangel Michael leaves you with a simple but powerful reminder. Do not return to what you have outgrown. Do not abandon the clarity you have built. Do not confuse familiarity with alignment. And do not forget that what is meant for you does not require you to lose yourself to receive it. Because now you are no longer becoming aligned. You are living from alignment. And from that state, what is divinely synchronized with you will not only arrive, it will remain. At this final threshold of the message, something shifts that cannot be reversed. Not because destiny suddenly changes direction, but because your awareness finally stops resisting what has already been forming beneath the surface of your life. Archangel Michael does not speak to you now as someone who is waiting. He speaks to you as someone who is arriving. And that distinction changes everything. Because waiting carries tension, but arriving carries presence. And presence is where divine timing finally becomes visible in the physical world. Take a moment to notice what has already changed inside you throughout this journey. The confusion that once felt overwhelming no longer dominates your thoughts in the same way. The emotional noise that once filled your inner world has begun to soften. The urgency you once carried around, when things would happen has slowly dissolved into something quieter. Not indifference, not resignation, but trust. A trust that does not require constant confirmation. A trust that does not collapse under uncertainty. A trust that simply exists, even when answers have not yet fully arrived. This is the final preparation state before manifestation becomes physical. Archangel Michael calls this the threshold of embodied alignment. Because at this stage, alignment is no longer something you are developing. It is something you are expressing through how you think, through how you respond, through how you choose yourself in moments of uncertainty. Now, something very important becomes visible in this phase. You no longer react from your past self. When triggers appear, they do not define your emotional direction. When memories surface, they do not pull you into old cycles. When uncertainty rises, it no longer dictates your behavior. Instead, there is a pause, a space between stimulus and response. And in that space, awareness lives. This is where transformation becomes permanent. Because as long as reaction controls you, cycles repeat. But when awareness leads you, cycles dissolve. Now Archangel Michael reveals something that marks this final threshold clearly. You begin to feel like your life is no longer being prepared. It is being revealed. And revelation feels different from anticipation. Anticipation carries tension toward the future. Revelation carries clarity in the present. You stop asking, when will it happen? And begin sensing. It is already unfolding. Not in imagination, but in subtle shifts of reality. You may notice synchronicities increasing again, but differently than before. Not as signs to decode, but as confirmations you no longer need to chase meaning from. They simply pass through your awareness, reinforcing a quiet inner knowing. You may also notice that certain people from your past no longer occupy emotional space in your mind. Not through forceful detachment, but through natural completion. Their presence in your emotional field becomes neutral. And neutrality is one of the strongest indicators that energetic cycles have closed. Because what once activated you no longer has access to your emotional system. Now, Archangel Michael draws your attention to something deeper. At this stage, your twin flame connection is no longer a distant concept. It becomes a field of awareness that exists alongside your daily life. Not intrusive, not overwhelming, but present. Like something you are gradually learning to recognize without needing explanation. And recognition becomes the key theme of this threshold. Because the twin flame connection is not entered through pursuit. It is entered through recognition of alignment that already exists. This means something very important. You are not moving toward your twin flame. You are becoming the version of yourself who can recognize them without confusion. And recognition does not come from emotion alone. It comes from energetic coherence. Now, at this stage, something subtle but powerful begins to happen in your external world. Life starts to feel less random. Events begin to feel connected, even when they appear unrelated on the surface. Delays no longer feel like obstruction. They feel like synchronization points aligning invisible timelines. And what once felt like waiting begins to feel like structure. A structure you could not see before, but can now sense. Archangel Michael explains this clearly. Divine timing is not the absence of movement. It is the alignment of invisible movement becoming visible. This is why everything begins to feel different now. Not because life suddenly changes, but because you are finally perceiving it through aligned awareness. Now you may begin to notice another shift. You stop trying to force clarity. You stop trying to interpret every emotion. You stop trying to control outcomes that are still forming. Instead, you begin to allow life to reveal itself at its own pace. And this allowance is not passive. It is deeply active inner trust. Because it requires you to release control while remaining fully present. That is one of the highest forms of alignment. Now Archangel Michael brings one final truth into this chapter. What is meant for you does not arrive when you are searching for it. It arrives when you are no longer resisting yourself. This means your twin flame connection is not activated by effort. It is activated by coherence. And coherence means your thoughts, emotions, and actions are no longer in conflict with your inner truth. You stop abandoning yourself to maintain connection with others. You stop sacrificing clarity for emotional familiarity. You stop choosing confusion over peace. And in that stopping, something opens. Not externally first, but internally. A sense that you are no longer fragmented. No longer divided between who you were and who you are becoming. You are simply present. And presence is the final gateway. Because in presence, there is no distortion of timing. There is only alignment. Now, as this final chapter unfolds, Archangel Michael gently reframes everything you have experienced. Nothing was delayed. Nothing was lost. Nothing was taken without purpose. Everything was being synchronized into a version of reality you could finally sustain. And now that synchronization is becoming visible. Not as fantasy, but as structure. Not as hope, but as lived experience beginning to form. And the most important truth of all arrives quietly here. You will not recognize your twin flame through intensity. You will recognize them through peace that does not destabilize you. Because real alignment does not confuse your nervous system. It calms it. It does not fragment your awareness. It centers it. And it does not make you question your worth. It confirms your wholeness. So as you move beyond this message, Archangel Michael leaves you with the final reflection. Do not return to uncertainty just because it feels familiar. Do not confuse emotional intensity with divine truth. And do not forget that what is aligned with you will not require you to lose yourself to receive it. Because at this threshold, divine timing is no longer something you are waiting for. It is something you are living. And what has been quietly unfolding beneath everything you thought was delay is now becoming your reality. This is the final transmission. Not because your journey ends here, but because something within you has reached a point where continuation no longer requires external confirmation. Archangel Michael speaks now in a quieter tone. Not to intensify emotion, but to stabilize truth. Because truth, when fully received, does not need repetition. It becomes internal knowing. And internal knowing is what carries you forward from this moment onward. Take a moment to notice something important. You are no longer the same person who first heard this message. The urgency has softened. The confusion has dissolved into clarity. The emotional turbulence that once shaped your perception has been replaced by something steadier. A grounded awareness that does not collapse when uncertainty appears. This is not imagination. This is integration completing its final layer. And Archangel Michael names this stage the embodiment of divine alignment. At this level, alignment is no longer something you are moving toward. It is something you are now living through. Every breath, every decision, every moment of awareness carries the imprint of what has been rebuilt inside you. And because of that, something fundamental shifts in how reality responds to you. Not dramatically, but precisely, subtly, consistently. You begin to notice that life no longer feels fragmented into signs, delays, and confusion. Instead, everything starts to feel part of a coherent unfolding. Even what once felt like obstacles now appear as structural steps in a larger design. Even silence begins to feel meaningful instead of empty. Even waiting loses its emotional charge. Because waiting implies lack. But you are no longer operating from lack. You are operating from alignment. Archangel Michael now reveals something essential. Your twin flame timeline is no longer opening. It has opened. And what you are experiencing now is the stabilization of that opening into lived reality. This does not mean everything appears instantly in physical form. It means the energetic conditions required for physical recognition are now active and sustained. In other words, the field is ready. And when the field is ready, manifestation no longer needs force. It needs allowance. Now, something very subtle begins to happen at this stage. You stop interpreting life and start experiencing it directly. You no longer need to assign meaning to every emotional fluctuation. You no longer need to decode every interaction. You no longer feel the need to predict outcomes in order to feel safe. Instead, there is a growing sense of trust in what is unfolding moment by moment. Not blind trust, but grounded trust. A trust that is built from experience, not assumption. Because you have already seen what happens when you abandon yourself. And you have already experienced what happens when you return to your truth. And that comparison has become your inner compass. Now Archangel Michael brings forward the most important truth of this entire journey. Your twin flame is not arriving into your life as a change. They are arriving into your life as recognition of who you already are. This means the connection is not meant to complete you. It is meant to mirror your completeness. And completeness is not perfection. It is coherence. The absence of internal contradiction. The presence of emotional stability that does not depend on external validation. This is why everything had to shift within you first. Because without internal coherence, external recognition would become distortion. Not union, but repetition of old emotional patterns in a new form. Now, as this final transmission unfolds, Archangel Michael invites you to observe something very carefully. Your emotional reactions have changed. Situations that once destabilized you no longer define your inner state. People who once held emotional power over you no longer control your sense of self. And thoughts that once spiraled into fear now pass through awareness without taking root. This is emotional sovereignty. And emotional sovereignty is the foundation of divine union. Because union cannot survive in emotional dependency. It can only thrive in emotional stability. Now, something even more profound begins to emerge. You no longer feel far from your twin flame timeline. That sense of distance dissolves. Not because physical reality has fully manifested the connection yet, but because your perception of distance has changed. What once felt like separation now feels like synchronization. Not everything is visible, but everything feels aligned. And that feeling is more accurate than mental interpretation. Because alignment is felt before it is seen. Archangel Michael now emphasizes something deeply important. Do not return to the mindset of searching. You are now in the field of receiving. Searching creates fragmentation. Receiving creates coherence. Searching says, "It is not here yet." Receiving says, "It is already unfolding." And the shift between these two states determines how smoothly your timeline continues to stabilize. Now, as this final chapter reaches its deepest point, something sacred becomes clear. The journey was never about finding something outside of you. It was about dissolving everything within you that blocked recognition. Fear, attachment, confusion, emotional dependency, old cycles of pain and repetition. All of it was slowly being cleared so that what is real could finally be seen without distortion. And now that clarity exists. Not as perfection, but as presence. And presence is enough. Archangel Michael leaves you with a final reflection that ties everything together. You are no longer preparing for alignment. You are no longer entering alignment. You are now the living expression of alignment itself. And from this state, something begins to unfold naturally in your external world. Not as chaos, not as confusion, but as recognition. A meeting that does not destabilize you. A connection that does not confuse you. A bond that does not require you to lose yourself in order to experience it. Because what is truly divine never asks you to abandon your wholeness. It confirms it. So as this final transmission closes, understand this clearly. Your twin flame timeline is no longer a distant spiritual concept. It is a living field of reality you are now moving through. And every step you take from here is no longer toward destiny. It is within it. And what has been unfolding all along is now becoming visible in the life you are finally ready to live. This is the final chapter. Not because the story ends, but because something within you no longer needs guidance in the same way it once did. Archangel Michael appears here not as a messenger of urgency, but as a presence of completion. There is no more warning. No more preparation. No more separation between you and what is coming. There is only integration. And integration means this. What you have been waiting for is no longer ahead of you. It is unfolding through you. Take a moment to feel that shift, because it changes everything. The twin flame timeline is no longer something you are trying to reach. It is something you are now living inside of. And living inside of it feels different than imagining it. It is quieter, more stable, less emotional turbulence, more inner certainty. At this stage, Archangel Michael reveals something profound. You will no longer experience your life in terms of signs and delays, because your perception has matured beyond interpretation. Instead of asking what everything means, you begin to understand that meaning is already embedded in everything. Not as something to decode, but as something to embody. Now, you may notice something subtle happening in your awareness. The past no longer feels emotionally charged. Not because it has been forgotten, but because it has been integrated. Memories remain, but they no longer define your emotional state. They no longer pull you backward into old versions of yourself. This is what completion feels like internally. You can remember without reliving. And that is freedom. Archangel Michael now brings forward the deepest truth of the entire journey. There was never a delay in your twin flame timeline. There was only preparation for recognition without distortion. This means every experience you went through had one purpose: to ensure that when alignment finally becomes visible, you are no longer viewing it through fear, confusion, or emotional dependency. Because those lenses distort truth. And divine connection cannot be perceived clearly through distortion. Now those distortions have dissolved. Not completely erased from memory, but no longer active in influence. You are no longer reacting from your wounds. You are responding from your awareness. And that difference is what makes this stage irreversible. Now, something very important becomes clear in this final phase. You stop looking for confirmation outside of yourself. You no longer need external validation to feel secure in what you sense internally. You no longer need repeated signs to trust what your intuition already knows. You no longer need emotional reassurance to stabilize your perception. Instead, there is a quiet certainty growing inside you. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady, like something that has always been true, finally being recognized. Archangel Michael calls this inner knowing without external dependency. And this is the final marker of completion. Because once inner knowing stabilizes, external reality begins to mirror it effortlessly. Now let's address something that naturally arises at this stage. You may wonder, if everything is already aligned, why is physical manifestation still unfolding gradually? The answer is simple yet profound. Because physical reality moves slower than energetic reality. Not because it is less powerful, but because it requires structure to catch up with frequency. Think of it like light passing through layers of material. The light is immediate, but the shadow it creates takes time to form fully in physical space. Your inner alignment is the light. Your external reality is the shadow becoming visible. And what you are witnessing now is synchronization completing itself. Not arrival as a surprise, but arrival as a reflection. Now Archangel Michael brings you into one final awareness. At this stage, you are no longer in transition. You are in embodiment. And embodiment means you no longer separate your spiritual understanding from your daily life. They become one experience. You do not switch between awareness and reality. You live from awareness within reality. This is why life begins to feel more coherent, less fragmented, less emotionally extreme, more stable in its unfolding. Even challenges that appear no longer destabilize your center. They are simply part of the flow. And because of that, something extraordinary begins to happen. You stop resisting what is happening and start recognizing it. Now Archangel Michael gently reveals the final truth about your twin flame connection. It was never hidden from you. It was never distant from you. It was never delayed in the way you believed. It was always unfolding in perfect synchronization with your inner state. And now that your inner state has stabilized, the outer reflection begins to align. Not instantly, but inevitably. Because alignment, once stabilized, does not reverse. It only deepens. Now, as this final chapter unfolds, something within you may feel a sense of quiet release. Not emotional intensity, but emotional resolution. A soft understanding that everything you once questioned has already been answered through experience itself. Not through explanation, but through transformation. And this is where Archangel Michael leaves you with the final transmission of this entire journey. You are no longer becoming aligned. You are no longer entering alignment. You are no longer waiting for alignment. You are alignment. And from this state, everything that is meant for you begins to recognize you without effort, without confusion, without resistance. Because what is truly divinely aligned does not require chasing. It requires resonance. And resonance has already been established within you. So now the final truth remains. What heaven has been preparing through your entire journey is no longer on its way. It is already unfolding in your reality. And what you are about to experience next is not a continuation of searching, but the beginning of living the life that has been quietly forming within you all along.